By the year 1750, slavery was reaching its peak in the British colonies and many other parts of the world. Although less widespread than elsewhere, during this period there were also slaves and indentured servants in Britain. In fact, it's believed that within an average estate, servants could number more than 600, performing a myriad of duties. Today we're going to explore their typical daily routine, so travel with me to the past as we start the video. In the 18th century, the British Empire expanded massively, acquiring territories and establishing colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, North America, India, and many other parts of the world. Most of the slaves acquired by these conquests remained in these colonies, but some were sent to England, where they were put to work in the residences and estates of the British aristocracy. These slaves were considered a symbol of status and prosperity for their owners. They were primarily engaged, alongside homegrown servants, in domestic duties, including cleaning, cooking, and personal assistance for their masters. Typically, a servant's intense workday began at 5 in the morning and ended around midnight. Just imagine working those harsh hours. The day began so early because the first task was cleaning the property, which had to be completed before the owners woke up. Any servant failing to do this could be harshly treated, including having their food ration cut or their already restricted rest time curtailed. Maids were also responsible for running errands and shopping. Such activities were considered desirable by the servants, as they allowed them a brief respite from the rest of their work. If you were born into this servitude, life was surely somewhat grey. A life of toil in enormous castles or stately homes with vast lands is something we can now only witness centuries later through paintings and historic recreations. Something that has no price. Well, except the price of being a servant for the British aristocracy. Maids had no fixed work schedule, which meant their free time was extremely limited. They only enjoyed a few free hours every 2 weeks on Sundays. This time was usually spent visiting family or attending church. The last activity also represented one of the few opportunities to interact with people outside their servitude. Maintaining private contacts was practically impossible because they were simply not allowed. Any consideration for a servant's own personal needs was virtually non-existent. Their work life was the center of everything. Staff had to be always available to attend to any and all requests and demands. The nights were often long, especially when there were guests in the house, which was often. Even after finishing their work, before going to bed, they only had time to mend their own clothes, which were always expected to be clean and in perfect condition. Or perhaps chat to a companion, who in many cases they shared a room with. And no, we're not talking about a cheap rental in New York. We're talking about England in the 18th century. These rooms were invariably small, unheated, and sparsely furnished. Although an average maid's food and lodging were provided, the quality of both was often very poor. Wet nurses, however, had it somewhat better. As they were in charge of caring for their master's children, they occupied a relatively high position amongst their peers. Since it was essential for a wet nurse to be in good health and produce plenty of nutritious milk, she was provided with more sufficient food. She also lived close to the master's family, sometimes even sharing a child's room. Naturally, this meant better accommodation than that for the rest of the household staff. Usually, wet nurses were married women, often farmers' wives, who were hired after they'd had their own children. Only in cases of extreme need was a single mother, who had recently given birth, employed. The children often developed a closer relationship with their wet nurses than their own biological mothers. Over time, this could lead to significant problems, especially when the master required his children to cut ties with their wet nurse when she was no longer needed. If the offspring resisted doing so, it was not the child that was punished, but the wet nurse, who could be sent to do agricultural work in order to sever any type of connection. Moving on now to a completely different servant's job. Working as a cook in the kitchen was considered one of the most distinguished and respected roles, since it did not involve performing dirty or unpleasant tasks, and the workload was generally lessened by other more junior staff, such as scullery maids. If a cook performed well, they were very much appreciated and often became proficient to an extremely high level. In general, however, a life of servitude was mostly very hard. It was really all about shedding the needs of your own life to serve that of your masters. Do you think that today's labor exploitation is as bad as back then? Do you think you could endure a week of this type of routine? Tell me your answers in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and activate your notifications so you know when we post our next video and you can join us. We'll see you soon.